best we can. And I'll speak first. My background is as a physician and then for many years a leader of the Noyce Foundation, which supported math and science education nationwide, and now I'm chair of STEM Next, which supports after-school science experiences for kids, but I am also an author and a publisher at Tumblehome Books, which publishes science-related books for kids. And we're at booth 1288. I'll say that again. All right. Here's a little poem to get us started. And this poem is from a nice collection that got an NSTA, is on the NSTA recommends list. It's called The Poetry of Science, the Poetry Friday Anthology for Science for Kids. And there's a lot of good elementary level poems in science, many of them in beautiful picture books, but I'll just read this to you. There are so many questions I could ask. Which one is the right one? Some questions are simple. Who, what, where, when? But simple questions usually have simple answers. They take me only so far. There are others though. Why? What if? Could I try? These questions lead to observations, to answers that go deeper, further, that might even lead to more questions. I've heard that no question is wrong if you don't know the answer. I guess the right one depends on what you want to know. Okay, so the editor in me thinks this isn't really a poem, it's prose, chopped up into little lines, but the sense of it, I think, is very good for science education. And this leads to one of the uses I think is great for poetry in the classroom, which is just to read a poem at the beginning of a class to set the mood. And I think it would not be difficult at the elementary level to find a poem a day. At the middle and high school level, it becomes a little harder, and that's why we pulled together a little anthology of science poems for middle and high school, which I'm going to show you later when my assistant brings it to me. Well, Tumblehome Books and Tumblehome Learning are based really on the premise, our belief that fiction can increase students' engagement and interest in science, that there's a whole set of kids out there that love to read, they aren't sure they love science. There may be a set of kids out there who love science who aren't sure they love to read, but the truth is, although we've moved away from vocabulary and things like that in science, if you're not a great reader, you're not going to be able to go as far in science as you would like. So our goal has been to pull those two areas of interest together. And in doing so, we have tried to keep up with whatever research there is that addresses this issue of whether reading narrative in science class helps kids learn science. So I'm going to tell you what the research is that we draw on. Well, probably all of you, I asked a set of school librarians this last week and nobody knew this of the Thai study, of Robert Thai's study, but I think most science teachers do. If you look for the best predictor of what students will complete a major in a science field, the best predictor we have from longitudinal studies is what they say they want to be at the end of 8th grade. If they say, I want to be a scientist, their chances of actually completing a science degree are better than if they have top math scores, for example. We know, or we believe, there's not a lot of objective research on this, that role models are important, and we constantly quote different people, but I think Marion Wright Engelman was the one who actually said this, that you can't be what you can't see. Robert Thai's group went on and did a further study looking at college students across a wide variety of colleges who were or in science majors or were not, and they found that the students who view science programs and read about science are 1.7 to 7 times more likely to select a STEM measure, and you may say that's a really wide range. Well, the 7 is those who also said in middle school that they liked science and wanted to be in science. So if you capture them early and then keep their interest in reading about STEM or watching STEM, there's a very good chance that they may persist. There is a very little bit of research about what happens to students' achievement when they read fiction about science. One source that I didn't put in here is the many studies that the Lawrence Hall of Science did with their stems of science, seeds of science, roots of reading program over many years, which showed improved reading, writing, and science skills, especially among ELL students. But here are a couple of other, and I'm giving you a lot of time to write down what it says on this slide so I don't have to say it. But basically, there have been studies at the 4th grade and at the 6th grade that look at long-term use in classroom of either an integrated program of reading and science or reading especially to support science. This is not specifically fiction. I just have to give that caveat. This is a study we would like to do, so if any of you would like to do it with us, let us know. This is one of my favorite studies. How many of you have heard of this study, Even Einstein Struggled? So in this study, a group of 9th and 10th graders were randomly assigned readings about 3 scientists. They all read about 3 scientists, but they read different versions of an 800-word essay. The scientists were Einstein, Faraday, and Marie Curie. And the 3 versions were this. One version said, here's this scientist and all the great things they discovered. And one version said, here are all the personal struggles this person went through in their life before becoming this scientist. And the third one said, here are the intellectual struggles, the times that they didn't do well, the mistakes they made, all the failures along the way. And 8 weeks later, the researchers looked at the students' grades. And the students in the group that said, this is a great scientist, look at all their accomplishments, their grades fell. And the grades in the other 2 groups stayed the same or improved. And the improvement was most marked among the lowest achieving students. So I think this is a strong sign to us, which we take very much to heart, that we should show scientists as not superhuman, but real people with the same old problems everyone else has, and with plowing through those problems to get to where they want to go. So as I've looked more at this work, I've become very interested in this 4-phase model of interest development created by, or pulled together by Anne Renninger and Suzanne Heedy. And these are the 4 stages that they talk about. And I'm going to say a little more about each of these. Triggered situational interest, maintained situational interest, emerging individual interest, and sustained individual interest. And I think this is important. It's a step up from thinking about engagement. We talk a lot about science experiments or going to a museum or something and getting engaged, but there's a long progression to go from what a science educator I used to know called a momentary interlude to something that is more sustained and sustaining and will carry the student along through hard times. Phase 1 is called triggered situational interest, and the idea here is that something outside the student, like a science demonstration, excites them. This carries on in all areas, not just science, by the way. So it could be a conversation, or it could be something that they read. And when it's something that they read, it usually comes from a character that they really relate to, or incongruous information, something that's really unexpected, or a surprising event. And it catches their interest, and this leads to positive emotion. And when you're reading, when the kid is reading, it actually leads to improved reading comprehension and attention and integration of the knowledge into new areas. So that's it. You've got to catch their interest the first time, catch their engagement. Maintain situational interest persists over repeated episodes or a longer period of time, it is still primarily supported from outside. So this is where you have the librarian helping the kid choose another book, or you have book discussion groups in the classrooms so that people can bounce their ideas off of each other, and there's the social engagement along with just the outside stimulus. It appears that conducive learning environments include project-based learning, cooperative group work, and of course individual tutoring, because then there's this back and forth and feedback and reinforcement that the child gets. This is one reason kids love series. If they have an author that they really relate to, they'll just go back to it again and again, because they're getting that same sort of pleasure and feeling of, I'm getting something here. This is something I relate to. So now we really make a step. This is a big step up, I think. Emerging individual interest, and this means the student comes back to certain content again and again, and more of this is self-motivated at this time. It's motivated by their positive feelings that they've experienced when engaging with this content. And this may be partly a sense of competence or emerging expertise. And individuals at this point begin to form their own, what we call curiosity questions. So they're not just taking in information anymore, or you, the teacher, are not having to supply all the questions. The kid starts to come up with questions of their own. When I think of this, I think of little kids who love dinosaurs, and they want more and more and more and more, and they're going to ask you more questions than you can answer. And phase 4 is well-developed interest. This is the interest that can carry a kid through a major in science in college. And it's characterized by so much in terms of positive feelings. There's a lot of stored knowledge. The person places a lot of value on this content that they're engaging with and that they know. They think it's, they may not understand why other people aren't as fascinated as they are. And at times, work with this content can feel effortless. I think they can really experience flow when engaging with this content. And that happens to me sometimes when writing. Other times it doesn't happen at all, and it's a struggle and it's a slog. But having experienced that and having come back many times, I have enough, I place enough value on this area of knowledge that I'm going to persist. And students who have reached this level have a growing sense of competence, self-efficacy, and autonomy. And I'd just like you to sort of just take a moment and think about your students and your classrooms and maybe experiences that you think help bring students along these paths. Where are they? Where are they in their development? So if anyone wants to say anything, please speak up, but otherwise we'll just sit for a moment and then go on.
Penny?
Yes?
When I was in the classroom, I raised a South Asian prawn called the macrobrachium. I used to buy them and keep them in tanks, and the kids would watch them, and maybe the lesson had to do with how they moved around or how they interacted. But actually, the more they watched, the more their questions got very intricate.
Yeah.
At first, they just wanted to know how they lived, what they ate, that kind of thing. But now they wanted to know, when do they breathe? How do they breathe?
Yeah.
And so it makes me feel good to see that.
Yeah.
Just as a student myself, I didn't like science at all, and then I took project physics, and the readers that they had were all about scientists and their struggles and all this, and I read those readers backwards and forwards. I kept them for like 30 years because, it was like Faraday and all these people. It was just really interesting to me, and it was the first time I really thought, oh, science is not just this dead subject that people shouting at you to memorize stuff.
I think that part of what we're hearing is you don't know what will catch a certain kid, and that's part of why we try to offer different ways. So as I, as a publisher, look at the science literature that's out there for kids, these are the things that I am concerned about in fiction for science, or things that I think are sometimes issues that I'd like to address in the work that we publish. So I'm not saying anything against science fiction. I love science fiction. A gazillion boys got into tech because of science fiction. But it has a limitation, which is that some science fiction is rather magical, or technology it rises above character, and that may not appeal to all kids. It may not appeal to some girls. It may appeal a lot to some boys. Some characters are unrelatable geniuses. They were just brilliant from the start, and they're fun to read about, but they're not me. So you don't get that kind of relationship that may lead to deeper engagement. Characters often lack diversity, especially books written farther in the past. Few books actually show the process of science. There's this sort of magical element that, here's science, and now we can do this. And related to this, literature tends to be ahistorical. It's where we are now, but not how did we get here, what were the processes or the learnings that got us here. And those are the things that we try to address in some of our fiction. And I've put some examples up here. The top 3 are novels that we've published that have won NSTA Outstanding Science Awards. And you can see them at booth 1288. Told you I was going to tell you that again. So the 3 top ones, all by chance, feature middle school girls who do not think of themselves as science people at all, who kind of get sucked in. And as I was preparing this lecture, I realized that the girls themselves model those 4 phases of interest development, because something happens. In this case, the girl finds a lot of dead fish by her aunt's organic apple orchard. In the one on the far right, a girl who loves fish happens to catch or find this fish that is completely weird and has feet and is blind, and nobody else has ever seen this fish before. So she has to figure out where it comes from. And the one in the middle, the girl mosquitoes don't bite her, and she doesn't think any of this until a classmate says, this is great for our science project, and the classmate's father, who runs a pharmaceutical company, says, this is really something interesting. I want to explore the genetics of this in your father's family. And she ends up on a trip to Africa, where she has all sorts of adventures. The one on the bottom left, you may all know, but it's a story about it's autobiographical, about a boy from Malawi, based on one battered physics book that he found in the Shed Library near his town. He studied it and eventually built a windmill to provide energy for his family. And this led to him going to Dartmouth and getting a degree in engineering. After surviving a period of famine in his country. So it's really a story of where science can take you. And the one on the right is a book that you may all, I think we have enough, you may all get a free copy of if you come to our booth. Number 1288, after the top. And it's a series of biographies of a set of very diverse inventors and makers from the earliest days of the Republic to today. And there's a chapter in it about my father, who invented the integrated circuit. Now I'm going to introduce Cary Sneider. He became one of our authors at Tumblehome, and he has a story about a boy who goes through these stages himself.
So, there we go. So I'm the author of Jake and the Quake, and as we were planning this, my job was to describe to you how Jake and the Quake reflects the qualities of a really good science book for kids that Penny just described. But I have another agenda item, and I don't want to hide it. I want to get it right out there. That when you walk out of here, I would like you to be thinking, hey, I could write a book for kids that would really get their interest. And so I want to start, I'll tell you about the book in a minute, but I want to give you the story of of the book, of how it got written. Because on the one hand, it wrote itself. On the other hand, it wasn't easy. So be prepared. I never had my own children. So I always saw kids from the viewpoint of the teacher, not from the viewpoint of the parent. But I met my wife, my now wife, back in the 1980s, around 88 in fact. And she had a 10-year-old son. And I would, spend weekends in San Francisco. I lived across the Bay of Berkeley, and really got to be part of the family. And he was an unusual kid. Had a hard time making friends a lot, but he did have a couple of friends around, and it was a very mixed racial group, and kind of, I'd say, lower middle class kids, and I fit right in. And so one day, he and his friends thought they'd have some fun. So they saw these fire extinguishers hanging in buildings that were very easy to get to. They wanted to have a fire extinguisher fight, and they had a ball. Of course, it was interesting, how do you recharge fire extinguishers? Because I felt the responsibility to put them all back. There were lots of adventures like that. And so I really got to see the world of kids, listen to them talk to each other, got a feeling for what dialogue really is, and the kinds of things that they talk about, and what boys in middle school talk about, and the boy-girl separation at that age still, and so forth. Anyway, so 1989 was the Battle of the Bay, and the Oakland A's and the San Francisco Giants were vying for the World Series. And the second game of the series, all of a sudden the ground shook. 1989, Loma Prieta earthquake. 66 people died in that earthquake, and the Bay Bridge collapsed. The marina section was in flames. That week I happened to be in Japan. And I was going to meet, right after that, like the day after, I was going to meet Liz and Gabe, my wife and son, and my wife's mother in Hawaii. So this was a big thing. And all of a sudden, I couldn't reach them by phone. So it was rather terrifying. A Japanese businessman on the plane, helped read the paper for me and interpret for me, so I kind of had some sense of what was going on. And so things were only delayed a day. We had a great week in Hawaii, in fact, and the rest is history. So, but when I got back, the stories were pouring out. And Gabe was telling me what it was like, and Liz was telling me what it was like when she was across the city from him and so forth. And I also got really interested in other people's stories. And I read the papers, and I went to microfiche. And the Exploratorium had recorded people's stories and how profound it is like to go through a life-threatening experience, and how people's lives changed. Now, I had always wanted to write something or create a movie or something where it's not the parents or the scientists are the ones that are teaching the kids, but the other way around. The kids are the ones that are finding out, discovering things, and teaching not only the adults, but the scientists, and teaching them what really nature science is really like, because sometimes scientists get off track a little bit. They get a little too enthusiastic about their theories. So that's really the background of the book. And I just started writing, and had a draft by, I would say, 1990. And then came all those wonderful rejections, and one after another. But over the years, every few years, I'd return to it and do a little more writing and improve it, maybe send it to somebody else. And I'd kind of forgotten about it. And then I found out that Penny created this publishing company for books, for fiction, about kids and science. So I've known Penny for probably 10 years before I had the courage to say, hey Penny, I wrote a book like this once. And she said, well, let me see it. And she had excellent suggestions for editing and improving it. And here it is, Jake and the Quake. And I illustrated it, by the way, because I like doing this sort of thing in my spare time. So here's a little bit about Jake and the Quake. First of all, it was propelled by the real event, the actual earthquake. And this is an actual scene from Oakland, where there was a double-decker highway, and the top layer of this 2-mile section collapsed onto the middle deck, and it was filled with cars. This is where most of the people died, but it just must have been absolutely horrendous and terrifying to be in it. These are the kids, and they are not special. They are kids who are struggling with a big middle school and a somewhat disinterested administration just trying to maintain control, difficult situations. And the kids are struggling with their own identities. Who am I? What is my future like? Because they're starting to realize that, you know, their future could go this way or go that way. But they have friends. And so there are really three protagonists in this. Jake, who is white and like my son, and Tony, who's Hispanic, and Tony is Jake's only friend. And Tony is pretty charismatic, and the girls really like him. And Jake always wondered, why is Tony my friend? But they're friends. And the third one is Melody. And when Jake and Tony are crawling around on the rocks underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, Jake discovers this rock that has this odd layer of really, like, they look like glass beads. Just something he'd never seen before. So Tony helps him, they pull it down, but the next day they want to find out more about it, and they know about this 8th grade girl. Now they're in the 7th grade. You don't go just talking to 8th grade girls, you know. But she gets interested, and it turns out she has a geology lab in her basement. And just, they take out the magnifying glass, they do a bunch of tests and so forth. So you learn a little bit about what you do with rocks and so forth to study them. And they all start learning about it. And Jake goes to UC Berkeley to find out more, the geology department, and finds out about this theory about an asteroid that struck the Earth that might have caused the demise of the dinosaurs. And oddly enough, when asteroids strike the Earth, they create these little bead-like things called tektites. And you know, as the kids learn about these theories, Tony's the one who's the real scientist who said, well, that's just a theory. What's the evidence for that? And so they come up with a science fair project and so forth. And so, you know, there are alternative theories. Was it volcanoes, or was it earthquakes, and so forth? And so I'm not going to tell you the rest of the story because I want you to read the book. But what's interesting is in the New York Times a few days ago, March 29th, there is a story about a 4-foot layer of sediment in North Dakota that had been studied for years, and it was just being published. And it is there are a lot of fish, and in the gills of the fish are these little tektites. And very, very strong evidence that, and the chemical composition of those tektites is the same as the chemical composition of tektites around the Gulf of Mexico, where it's likely that there was a very large, huge impact of a asteroid about 66 million years ago. So today, Tony would have loved this, to have this discovery. So it's very current today, actually. So I'm going to leave that at this point, and I'm going to introduce Amanda Clapp, who's going to tell you more about her class and literature.
Hi, my name's Amanda. I'm a classroom teacher. I am a product of Massachusetts Public Schools, and I worked in informal education for a really long time. So I was a naturalist all over the country for a few years, went to grad school. I started teaching for my it's pretty neat. Like, you know, you go to grad school and people pay for it. If you're in the sciences, I was studying lemurs, and I was studying conservation, and I had been to Madagascar and all this cool stuff. Anyway, I think I was teaching this biology lab for undergraduates who were not biology majors, and they couldn't kind of define cells or the basic way that all living things are connected. And I said, oh man, I quit the PhD program and started teaching middle school. So that's kind of how I ended up as a teacher. I think that scientific literacy is so important, and teaching in like teaching everybody, of course, but that upper elementary, middle school time is that time of wonder that I've always been able to connect with kids. I teach in rural North Carolina, and I teach at a lab school. So a lab school is brand new in North Carolina. It's a public school that's run by a university in cooperation with the local district. And so kids who are not achieving success in public schools can apply and come hang out with us. So I teach a lot of kids across motivation and ability spectrums. So the point for me is always the hook, right? How are we gonna get all of our people to engage in science at a deeper level, something that's more than just the superficial laundry list that Marilyn mentioned early, right? We just don't want to do that. So I've tried to incorporate novels quite a few times in my class, and these are 3 examples of novels I've used in my science classes. So the Weirdo has anybody read the Weirdo? Oh, it's cute. So it's probably, I'm so bad at reading levels, but like 4th, 5th, 6th-ish. And it's about an average kid who really likes the woods, doesn't like school. He gets wrapped up in a scheme in a swamp, and it's a conservation story and like a good old boy kind of story, which really appeals to the folks I work with. The one in the middle, Empty, I've read that with 9th graders, but you could read it with 7th or 8th graders too. And in Empty, all of the fossil fuels disappear, and the teenagers have to save the world, of course. And then this year, as part of a project-based learning unit with my 8th graders, we read Mosquitoes Don't Bite Me, and that's Penny's book. It's available at booth 1288. And so I partnered with my language arts teacher, and she actually read it with the students there, but then we added layers and layers based on what the students kind of were taking away. And as Penny mentioned in the beginning, there's some science fair ethics stuff that happens. The kids were really interested in that, because in middle school you're always working on collaboration and what that means. You know, and so some of those ethics issues that are brought up that my students have dealt with the slacker partner, you know, that kind of stuff. But content-wise, the students were doing a project-based learning unit on diseases. So that was one hook, was reading Penny's book. Another hook was going to the university that we partner with, and they just happened to have a mosquito lab, and the professor met with them, and the students looked at all of the mosquitoes that they're growing, that they're modifying. They learned about vector-borne illnesses and worked in this lab for the day. So one of their products was having to do outreach about diseases, right? So this is an example of 8th graders teaching 5th graders about how to wash your hands correctly and not spread diseases. Their work, since this was kind of all of our first foray together into project-based learning, was, I tried to zoom in, but it's fuzzy, isn't it? It was like, okay, we'll do better next time. And if you've done PBL, then you know that feeling like, oh man, we can do better next time. We're all learning together. So part of this was also using science to support writing. So the students, this was a few weeks long project, and the students had to record their process using blogs. So they just pretty much recorded their trials and tribulations with their group, their planning documents, what they were learning in the form of a blog, and that was really successful as well. All right, so one of the other things I do is I teach science methods to pre-service teachers. And last week in our class, we have been reading House of the Scorpion. And House of the Scorpion by Nancy Farmer is like an 8th, 9th level read, I would say. But these are the notes from class, because I asked them, what books would you suggest that you've read that you could use in science class? So it gets really messy, and that's all me. But the second dot, can you think of other books? Now I only have 5 students in this one section, and these are all the ones that they came up with because they remembered them from 6th, 7th, 8th high school, and they were so excited they just started sharing them. So we had this list, and then we had to go up the side, and I added some more that went over there, and I just wanted to share those titles and also just share the enthusiasm, because even though I teach the science methods class, none of the students I'm teaching right now want to be science teachers when they grow up, but they could all find connections with their favorite books and science content that we had discussed. So I guess my one take home would be that the books are excellent books, and which one you pick is not always as important as what you do with it next.
Yeah, we still have a little time. So before I read the poem up there, so don't read it yet. This is the little collection of 102 science poems for Weirdo High School that includes some poetry by Nobel laureates, some by college students, some funny, but most of it fairly serious in 10 different areas of science. 7 stories about the moon. I would urge you to come by and, well, either just note it down or come by and booth.
1288.
And look at it, get a brochure, things like that. Where's the poem? Here it is. This is an elementary school poem. Miss Fletcher's class is raising frogs. Our class is raising flies. Her room is just across the hall, which is where the problem lies. Our class began with little worms and hers with pollywogs. But soon our worms turned into flies and hers to hungry frogs. See, we're studying metamorphosis here. Last night the frogs in Fletcher's room escaped across the hall. They hopped right in and found our flies and nearly ate them all. This morning they're so full of flies they look like they could choke. Our teacher says if they do it again, those frogs are going to croak. So poetry can be fun. And I did talk about research. Cary and I were thinking about a research project last fall, and then we ran into a little bit of logistics problems, but we're going to try it again. So if you think there's something you would like to try or explore about using fiction and poetry in a science classroom, get in touch with us. You can reach all of us through me, Penny Noyce at tumblehomebooks.org. Now, questions, discussion, we have a little time. Marilyn?
So, you mentioned having books that look like the kids that you're teaching, and we have a project where we give 500 books out to a classroom teacher, and the response has been overwhelming when the kids see a book where
Can you tell us some of the books?
Can you give a list of
Or
those?
what grade level?
You know, God, most of them that we've given out have been, elementary level, and the teachers have picked the books from us, you know, we have a book list. It's actually written about, you have some research, your project is called First Books, and, there are a number of foundations that support it, but, we get our funding through, Wipro, which is a technology company, but they have a whole listing on their website of all the different types of books.
Yeah, it's first book. We give them books. Another one is reader to reader. We give them overstock books, I'll be honest with you. But Marilyn, maybe you could send me a list of what are some of the most popular science ones, and we could post it on our website just as a kind of public service.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you come to our booth and sign our little list, I'll email it out to all of you. Just put
What booth?
just put books. Okay.
Is
Do
it-
you want to know what booth
Yes,
what
please.
booth
Could
number
you
is?
please remind us again?
Okay. It's 1288.
Perfect, thank you.
Any other comments or questions or thoughts that people have? Has anyone else tried actually assigning fiction or reading poems in their science classroom? Or with their pre-service teachers?
I have. I work at the zoo. I'm weird though, because I
Yeah.
work at the zoo. But yeah, we'll do like a picture book, and then it talks about an animal or something in the story about the animal, and then we'll meet that animal and talk about how it might be the same or different from the animal in the story.
That's great. Yeah, I think that even at the middle school, sometimes it can be really useful or even at the high school, to use a picture book as a starter. But I would also love to see some kids engage in something longer. You can't do that at the zoo. Well, you can encourage them to get certain books. We have a book coming out about orangutans that I'm going to show you when you come to the booth, so. Anybody else? Yes, in the back, behind you, Lavelle.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Then you're next.
We'll share. Or share time. We assign books, I know through our GT program, they assign books through summer.
Yes.
Like the kids read novels, and then they come back and discuss it, and that's the first lesson they hit. But I think we also need to hit the population that aren't the GT.
Yes.
I think those are the kids we need to work with as well.
Yeah.
So that.
Well, bringing in authors can also be very motivating for kids sometimes. Sometimes they will inspire the kids or lead the kids through a little bit of a writing exercise. And I can also mention a book that is an NSTA book by Katie Coppen, Coppens, which is all about writing in the science classroom. She happens to be one of our authors, but not with that book. But just some writing prompts or getting kids writing poetry, because and this may especially work well in upper elementary and middle school, asking them to observe closely, which is something that you do as a poet. That could be something that could also be integrated in. Lavelle, you had a question?
Yes, I was in a classroom 42 years with lots of subject areas, and I want to apologize to all the students I have had, where I gave a writing assignment over a weekend. And apologize to their parents for ruining the weekend, because the writing process is far harder than I ever imagined.
Lavelle, how long have you been working on your book?
6 years.
But I wanted to say to Amanda and Cary, you can answer too.
No,
Thanks.
it is harder than I thought.
Yeah.
And I think in a pre-service environment, teachers who are going into a classroom should write an article for a magazine. And they have to see how hard it is and how much editing has to be done before they go and lay that on kids. Go home and write this. It's gotta be 2 pages long. I'm so sorry to all my students.
Well, I want to go back and apologize to specific individual students whom I could have helped much more. We always have, as teachers, we always want to do better than we've done. And at the ends of our careers, that's when we really are ready to start. That's what membership's all about, though.
He got distracted by how many other books were you writing that were nonfiction, Cary?
Lots of things. None of them are as good as this one.
There's a lot of heart that goes into fiction.
Yeah.
Yes?
I teach high school science, and excuse me, I've done mostly nonfiction. We have had the advantage of, in my elective classes, of reading a nonfiction book, and then the students do primary and secondary research to support an open-ended question that then they present and lead in a community discussion. So we invite the community to come in and discuss a book. We partner with our public library book club, and so we can always rely on a few book club members to make sure they come in to discuss the book with students. And I apologize for coming in late because maybe you had.
No, we
to
didn't
get
talk
some-
about nonfiction or discussion groups, so that's very helpful.
Okay, so, and we're expanding it this year, so we have picked up Wish Tree. If you've heard of Wish Tree by Catherine Applegate, one and only Ivan author, okay? So we have expanded that because Wish Tree is a book for basically 3rd through 6th graders. And so my botany class, the main character is Red, a tree. And so we are partnering with 5th and 6th graders and a 9th grade language arts class and the botany class. So if you're a classroom teacher, don't think that you have, this is something to take on, whether it's poetry or fiction or whatever, by yourself. There are great resources at your school. My media specialist or librarian has been very helpful. Even our instructional coach has been very heavily involved. So there's just a lot of great opportunities. Don't feel like you have to do it on your own. And I think it's super valuable to, we've already started and we've had some discussions and reading time with the younger kids. It's great for both ages. So if you can hook up, I think, with other age groups, whatever end of the spectrum you're on, I think that can be very powerful. As long as the distance doesn't roadblock you, right? The buildings are too far away or transportation or whatever. There's a lot of really good opportunities, I think, from there. So
Yeah.
I think I, need to do more with fiction and the poetry, and that came to me in the beginning of Wish Tree. There is a poem,
Uh-huh.
and it just,
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and even if you work with fiction and it has a lot of science behind it, that really allows a way for maybe the older kids to become experts in leading a discussion or participating in a discussion with the community or younger kids. And this, when we talked about these stages of interest development, this idea of mentoring someone younger or being the expert in front of either younger kids or adults is certainly one of the things that would solidify or boost a sense of identity and engagement. Anybody else? Maybe I'll read a poem to you, but I have to choose one at random. Okay, this is a randomly chosen one called Ether the Imaginary, which was written by a previously unpublished poet in an online poetry group I was briefly part of. It's called Ether the Imaginary. This is a high school level one. After Michelson and Morley, the whole idea of the ether passed out of fashion. Instead, the new substrate became curved space-time. Ethereal means unworldly, spiritual even. What could be less earthly than a universe of mathematical symbols? So there's a physics class one for you.
Thank you.
All right, so I hope to see many of you at our booth, and if you do come, you will receive a copy of the Inventors, Makers, Barrier Breakers, which is 25 diverse inventors from colonial times to today, and we can talk more. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
love Hawaii. We love Hawaii. Oh, that is like our favorite. Yeah, that's like our favorite destination, vacation spot.